The brass key felt cold between my fingers as I turned it in the lock of my bedroom door. Christmas morning, 2024, and my own son had locked me away like some embarrassing family secret. Through the thin walls of Damien's suburban Minneapolis house, I could hear them laughing downstairs, my son, my daughter-in-law Vivian, and their two teenagers, Caspian and Liralee. The scent of honey-glazed ham drifted up from the kitchen, mixed with the artificial pine of their plastic Christmas tree. I pressed my ear against the door, my 67-year-old knees protesting as I crouched down. The hardwood was cold against my cheek, but I needed to hear this. I needed to understand what had become of my family. "Mom's finally quiet," Damien said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of exasperation he'd perfected over the past 6 months since I'd moved in. "Maybe we can actually enjoy Christmas for once." My chest tightened. I'd raised this boy, worked double shifts at the textile factory to keep him in clean clothes and hot meals after his father, Theodore, walked out. I'd sat through every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, every midnight fever watch, and now, at Christmas, I was the inconvenience. Vivian's laugh cut through the air like broken glass. Thank God. I was about to lose it if she complained about the stuffing one more time. Like, we get it. Serafina, your mother's recipe was better. But guess what? She's been dead for 20 years, and we're not running a museum here. The teenagers, my grandchildren, giggled. 17-year-old Caspian and 15-year-old Liralee, who used to beg for my stories about the old days, who used to help me bake cookies every Christmas Eve. Now they were part of the chorus, laughing at Grandma's expense. "No one here has patience for old lady drama," Vivian continued, her voice growing more animated. "I mean, she's been here 6 months and already reorganized my spice rack, criticized my cooking, and told us 10 times about how Christmas used to be different. Different how more boring." Caspian's voice cracked with teenage sarcasm. The laughter erupted again, and something inside me cracked like ice on a pond. Not broke cracked vibe. There's a difference. When something breaks, it's sudden, explosive. When it cracks, it's slow, inevitable, and far more dangerous. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting, and walked to the window. Damien's house sat on a cul-de-sac in suburban Minneapolis. All identical lawns and matching mailboxes. Through the frost-covered glass, I could see other families gathering, other grandmothers being welcomed into warm kitchens, not locked away like burdens. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, my bed now, since I'd sold my house 6 months ago and moved in with them. The quilt was one I'd made myself 30 years ago, when I still believed in family traditions and permanent homes. My fingers traced the pattern wedding ring stitches, each one a prayer for lasting love, for generations staying close. The irony wasn't lost on me. My purse sat on the dresser, containing everything I owned now that mattered: $847 in cash, my Social Security card, my driver's license, and a small photo of Damien at age 7, gap-toothed and proud, holding up a fish we'd caught at Mystic Lake Thornfield. That boy had loved me once, had needed me. I opened the purse and looked at the cash again. $847. Not enough for a deposit on an apartment, but enough for a bus ticket, enough for a hotel room for a week, maybe 2 if I was careful. Enough for a new beginning, though I couldn't imagine what that would look like at 67. Downstairs, someone turned on the television. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade was being replayed, and the familiar sounds of marching bands and commentators filled the house. Normal Christmas morning sounds for a normal family, just not a family that included me. I pulled out a piece of paper from the nightstand drawer, Vivian's expensive stationery, the kind she used for her book club invitations and charity committees. I stared at the blank page for a long moment, then began to write, "My dear family, thank you for making this Christmas so memorable. I've learned more about my place in this house in the past 6 months than I care to admit. I paused, listening to them laugh again downstairs. The pen felt heavy in my hand, weighted with 67 years of disappointment, of compromise, of putting everyone else's needs before my own. I've decided to give you the gift you really want for Christmas, my absence. Don't worry about me. I've managed to take care of myself for longer than you've been alive, and I remember how to do it. Damien, I hope you find the piece you're looking for. Vivian, enjoy your spice rack. It's organized alphabetically now, the way it should be. Caspian and Lirelay. Maybe when you're older, you'll understand why your grandmother needed to leave. Don't look for me. I'll be fine. With love and disappointment. Serafina Blackwood. I folded the note carefully and set it on the pillow. Then I opened my suitcase, the same one I'd used for my honeymoon in 1978, battered but still functional. I packed everything that mattered, 3 changes of clothes, my mother's jewelry, the photo of Damien, and my address book filled with names I hadn't called in years. At the bottom of the suitcase, I found something I'd forgotten, a business card from a real estate agent in northern Minnesota, Cordelia Ravencroft, specializing in rural properties. I'd met her at a rest stop 6 months ago when I was driving to Damien's house for the first time. She'd been friendly, talkative, and had mentioned something about old farmhouses going cheap in the lake country. People are always looking for places to start over, she'd said. Sometimes the best thing you can do is buy a house nobody else wants and make it into something beautiful. The afternoon stretched on, and around 2 p.m., the house grew quiet. Christmas dinner had ended, and from the sounds downstairs, everyone had settled in for their traditional post-meal nap. This was my chance. I slipped the business card into my coat pocket and zipped the suitcase closed. Instead of the dramatic window escape I'd initially considered, I waited until I heard Damien's familiar snores echoing from the living room. I quietly retrieved the spare key from the kitchen drawer, the same place Vivian had always kept it, and unlocked my bedroom door from the outside. Moving silently through the house, I paused only to look at the Christmas tree one last time. Presents were scattered underneath, wrapping paper crumpled and forgotten. A normal family scene, just without the inconvenient grandmother. I slipped out the front door, locking it behind me and sliding the key under the mat. The December air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and possibility. I walked to the end of the driveway and called a taxi, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. As the taxi pulled away, I didn't look back at the house where I'd been tolerated but never wanted. The driver, a kind Somali man named Ahmed, asked if I was sure about going to the Greyhound station on Christmas Day. Very sure, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. The Greyhound bus station in downtown Minneapolis smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, but it also smelled like freedom. I sat on a plastic chair that had seen better decades, my suitcase between my feet, watching the departure board flicker with destinations I'd never considered before Duluth. Grand Rapids, International Falls, places where nobody knew Serafina Blackwood, where nobody expected anything from me except the price of a ticket. A young man behind the ticket counter looked bored, his uniform wrinkled and coffee-stained. "Next," he called, though I was the only person in line. "I need a ticket north," I said, approaching the counter. "Somewhere with lakes, somewhere quiet?" He squinted at me over his glasses. "You looking for a specific destination, or just running away from Christmas?" The question caught me off guard. Was I that transparent? Lady, it's Christmas Day. Only 2 kinds of people buy bus tickets on Christmas: people visiting family and people escaping family. You don't look like you're headed to a reunion. I almost smiled. Almost. "Cedar Hollow," I said, remembering a name from the departure board. "When's the next bus?" 4:30. Gets you there around 8 tonight. You got a place to stay." I didn't, but I nodded anyway. "How much, Bez?" $37. I counted out the bills, watching my escape fund shrink to $810. The ticket felt thin in my hand. insubstantial for something that represented such a massive change. But I'd learned long ago that the biggest transformations often came wrapped in the smallest packages. As Minneapolis faded behind us, replaced by frozen farmland and scattered houses, I pulled out Cordelia Ravencroft's business card. The paper was soft from handling, the edges worn. I'd kept it all these months without really knowing why. Maybe some part of me had always known this day would come. The bus made stops in small towns I'd never heard of: Elk River, Zimmerman, Malacca. Each one looked the same, a main street with half the storefronts empty, a few cars parked outside a diner or gas station. The kind of places where people knew each other's business but minded their own. The kind of places where a woman could start over without anyone asking too many questions. At the Cedar Hollow station, which was smaller than a convenience store, with a single bench and a payphone that looked like it hadn't worked since the Clinton administration, I was the only passenger who got off. The temperature had dropped since Minneapolis, and my breath formed thick clouds in the evening air. I stood there for a moment, suitcase in hand, looking around at a town I'd never seen before. The main street stretched out in front of me, lined with shops that were closed for the holiday. A few streetlights cast yellow pools on the snow-covered sidewalk. It looked like a movie set, too perfect, too quiet, too much like the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Perfect. I walked toward the center of town, my boots crunching on the packed snow. The Pineview Lodge sat on the corner of Main and Pine, a 3-story building that had probably been elegant once. Now it looked tired, but clean. The kind of place that catered to fishermen and hunters, not suburban grandmothers fleeing family drama. The lobby was small and warm, with a fireplace that actually worked, and furniture that had seen better days, but still looked comfortable. An older woman sat behind the desk, reading a paperback novel. She looked up when I entered, her expression friendly but unsurprised, as if women with suitcases showed up at her hotel on Christmas night all the time. "You need a room?" she asked, closing her book. "Yes, please, just for tonight." I wasn't sure why I said that. I had no plans beyond tonight, no idea what tomorrow would bring. $45 that includes breakfast. She slid a registration form across the desk. "Name?" I paused, pen hovering over the paper. For a moment, I considered using a fake name, starting completely fresh. But Seraphina Blackwood had gotten me this far. She deserved to see how the story ended. "Seraphina Blackwood," I said, writing carefully. "Welcome to Cedar Hollow. Seraphina. I'm Magdalena Thornfield, but everyone calls me Maggie. I own this place." She handed me a key attached to a wooden block shaped like a loon. "Room 23, second floor. Breakfast is from 6 to 9, but I can make exceptions if you need to eat earlier." "Thank you." She studied me for a moment, the kind of look that saw more than it should. "You okay, honey? You look like you've had a long day." The kindness in her voice almost broke me. When was the last time someone had asked if I was okay and actually wanted to hear the answer? "I'm fine," I said, then added, "Just making some changes." "Well, sometimes changes are good. Sometimes they're necessary." She picked up her book again. "You need anything? I'm here till midnight. Restaurant across the street stays open late on holidays for folks like us who don't have anywhere else to go." Folks like us. The phrase followed me up the stairs to my room. It was small but clean, with a double bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the main street. I set my suitcase on the bed and sat down beside it, suddenly exhausted. That night, I wrote in the small notebook I'd started after Theodore died, the one I'd abandoned after 3 entries because I was too busy taking care of everyone else to take care of myself. December 25th, 2024, Cedar Hollow, Minnesota. I ran away from Christmas today. At 67 years old, I walked away from home like a teenager. And I'm not sorry. I don't know what comes next. I have $810 left, a hotel room for one night, and no plan. But for the first time in months, I'm not listening to someone tell me how much trouble I am, how much I cost, how much easier their life would be without me. I'm just quiet. And the quiet feels like possibility. Through the window, I could see the restaurant Maggie had mentioned. The lights were on, and I could make out people moving around inside. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I could order room service, eat alone in my room like I'd been doing for months, or I could go downstairs, walk across the street, and eat dinner in a room full of strangers who didn't know my history. I closed the notebook and stood up, catching my reflection in the dresser mirror. I looked older than I felt, grayer than I remembered, but my eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. Determined. Tomorrow, I would call Cordelia Ravencroft and ask about those farmhouses she'd mentioned. Tomorrow, I would start figuring out what Seraphina Blackwood wanted from the rest of her life. But tonight, I was just a woman in a hotel room, planning a future that belonged entirely to her. It was the best Christmas gift I'd ever given myself. I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains and the distant sound of snow plows scraping against asphalt. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back: the locked door, the laughter, the bus ride, the decision to start over at 67. Maggie's breakfast was simple but perfect: scrambled eggs, bacon, toast made from bread that tasted homemade, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I was the only guest in the small dining room, which gave me a chance to study the framed photographs covering the walls. Cedar Hollow through the decades Main Street in the 1950s, with twice as many businesses. 4th of July parades, ice fishing tournaments, high school graduations. "You sleep okay?" Maggie asked, refilling my coffee cup. "Better than I have in months." It was true. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of Damien's house, where I'd always felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the next criticism. "What brings you to our little corner of the world?" I hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm looking for a fresh start. Someone mentioned there might be houses for sale in the area." Maggie's expression brightened. "You thinking of staying? We could use more folks who appreciate the quiet life. You should talk to Cordelia Ravencroft. She's our local real estate guru, knows every property within 50 miles. After breakfast, I bundled up in my winter coat and explored the town. Cedar Hollow was bigger than it had seemed from the bus station population to 847, according to the welcome sign. Main Street stretched for 8 blocks, with a mix of occupied storefronts and empty ones. I counted a grocery store, a hardware store, a library, 2 churches, a diner, and what looked like a surprisingly well-stocked bookstore. The people I passed nodded and smiled, the way people do in small towns, where acknowledging strangers is still considered good manners. An elderly man clearing snow from his sidewalk waved when he saw me looking at his Victorian house. A woman about my age walking a golden retriever stopped to ask if I was visiting for the holidays. "Thinking about staying, actually," I heard myself say. "Well, that's wonderful. We love new neighbors. I'm Patricia Mills Pat. If you need anything at all, I'm in the yellow house on Elm Street." This was what I'd been missing. I realized. Not just kindness, but the assumption that I had something to contribute, that my presence was welcome rather than tolerated. Cordelia Ravencroft's office was tucked between the hardware store and a shop selling local crafts. A bell chimed when I pushed open the door, and a woman looked up from her desk. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 55, with silver-streaked brown hair and the kind of practical clothing that suggested she spent time outdoors. "You must be Seraphina," she said, standing to shake my hand. "Maggie called this morning, said you might be interested in some property. We met briefly at a rest stop 6 months ago. You mentioned farmhouses in the area." Her face lit up with recognition. "Of course you were moving in with your son. How's that working out?" "It isn't," I said simply. Cordelia nodded, her expression understanding rather than pitying. "Been there. Sometimes families and independence don't mix well. Well, let me show you what we've got." She spread several listings across her desk, but one immediately caught my attention. The photograph showed a white farmhouse with green shutters and a wraparound porch, surrounded by snow-covered fields. "That's the Winterbourne place," Cordelia said, noticing my interest. Evangeline Winterbourne lived there for 60 years, raised 7 children in that house. She passed last spring, 89 years old and sharp as a tack right up to the end. Her children all moved away decades ago, and they just want to sell and settle the estate. "How much?" I asked. Though I was afraid to hear the answer. "They're asking $28,000. Needs some work, the roof has a few leaks, and the kitchen could use updating, but the bones are solid. Built in 1924, so it's got character. Comes with 5 acres, including a nice vegetable garden and a small barn." $28,000. I had $800 to my name and a Social Security check of $1,247 that came in on the 3rd of each month. The math should have been impossible, but something about the house in the photograph made me want to find a way to make it work. "Can we see it?" Cordelia grabbed her keys and coat. "I was hoping you'd ask." The drive to the Winterbourne place took 20 minutes, winding through countryside that looked like a Norman Rockwell painting. Snow-covered fields stretched to the horizon, broken by clusters of pine trees and the occasional farmhouse. When we turned down a gravel road marked by a mailbox that read Winterbourne, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, the sense of coming home. The house was even more beautiful in person. 2 stories of white clapboard siding with forest green shutters, exactly as it appeared in the photograph. The wraparound porch sagged slightly in one corner, but it looked like it had hosted 1,000 summer evenings. A red barn sat behind the house, smaller than I'd expected, but solid-looking. "The owner died last spring," Cordelia explained as we parked. "Her kids live in California, want to sell quick and move on. Between you and me, they'd probably take less than asking if you could close quickly." We crunched through the snow to the front door. Cordelia produced a lockbox key with practiced efficiency, and the door opened with a creak that sounded like a sigh. The interior was frozen in time wallpaper with tiny roses, hardwood floors that needed refinishing, a kitchen with cabinets painted mint green and countertops covered in metal edging. But the windows were large and let in floods of natural light, and the rooms had the kind of generous proportions that modern houses never seem to achieve. "The furnace works," Cordelia said, leading me through the living room. "Plumbing's good, though the bathroom could use updating. The roof leaks in 2 spots, but nothing that can't be fixed." I walked through the rooms slowly, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. In the kitchen, I opened cabinet doors and found dishes left behind mismatched china, mason jars, a rolling pin worn smooth by decades of use. On the windowsill above the sink, someone had left a small ceramic rooster, its paint chipped, but its expression eternally optimistic. "Tell me about Evangeline," I said. "She was something special. She was never met a stranger, always had coffee on and cookies in the jar. After her husband died 15 years ago, she could have moved to town, but she loved this place too much to leave. Her neighbors said she was the kind of woman who made everyone feel welcome." I could picture her in this kitchen, gray-haired and aproned, teaching granddaughters how to make pie crust and listening to their secrets. The image felt familiar, like a memory I'd forgotten I had. "What happened to her things?" "The kids took what they wanted, donated the rest, but they left the furniture that was too big to move easily. There's a bedroom set upstairs, a dining room table that seats 8, some bookcases." Cordelia paused. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the woman who lived here." I wasn't sure how to explain that I felt a kinship with Evangeline Winterbourne, this woman I'd never met, who'd built a life in this house, who'd made it a place where people wanted to come. We climbed the stairs to the second floor, our footsteps creaking on wood that had supported the weight of generations. The master bedroom faced east, with windows that would catch the morning sun. A smaller room looked like it had been a nursery once, then converted to a sewing room, evidence of a life that had adapted and evolved with changing needs. In the bathroom, I turned on the faucet and was surprised when water actually came out, though it ran rusty for a few seconds before clearing. The clawfoot tub was stained but solid, the kind of thing people paid thousands of dollars for in Minneapolis antique stores. "I should mention," Cordelia said as we walked back downstairs, "the house comes with 5 acres. There's a vegetable garden that's overgrown now, but the soil's good, and the barn's structurally sound if you ever wanted to do something with it." 5 acres. I tried to imagine that much space belonging to me, that much privacy and possibility. In Damien's house, I'd been allocated 1 bedroom and shared bathroom privileges. Here, I could have 5 acres of solitude. What would I need for a down payment? Cordelia considered this. Normally, 15% would be $4,200. But like I said, they want to sell quickly. If you could put down $4,000 and agree to monthly payments, they might work with you. $4,000. It was more than I had, but not impossibly more. I thought about my Social Security payments, about the possibility of taking in boarders or starting some kind of small business. Can you call them right now? Right now. I stood on Evangeline's front porch, watching the sunset behind the pine trees, and made calculations in my head. If I could find a way to make this work, what would I do with this place? The answer came to me as clearly as if Evangeline herself had whispered it in my ear. I would make it a place where people felt welcome, where travelers could stop and rest, where women like me could find refuge and rediscover their worth. Cordelia stepped aside, speaking in low tones to someone in California. I watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder hanging from the porch eaves bright red against the white snow, taking his time with his evening meal. "Good news," Cordelia said, hanging up the phone. "They're interested. They'll take $25,000 with $4,000 down and $185 a month for 10 years. No credit check, no bank approval needed. They just want someone who will love the place." $185 a month was manageable with Social Security. $4,000 down was the challenge. I had $800 in my purse, maybe another $200 in my checking account. I needed to find $3,000 somewhere. "There's one more thing," Cordelia said. "They want to close by New Year's Day. If you're serious about this, we need to move fast." 5 days to find $3,000 and change my entire life. It should have felt impossible. But standing on Evangeline's porch, watching darkness fall over what could become my land, it felt inevitable. "I'm serious," I said. "Let me make some calculations tonight." That evening, back in my room at the Pineview Lodge, I spread all my financial documents on the bed: bank statements, insurance policies, investment accounts I'd forgotten about. The life insurance policy Theodore had left me was already spent on Damien's college loans. The small retirement account had been cashed out to pay for my mother's funeral. But then I remembered something Evangeline's house had triggered a story my mother used to tell about hiding money for emergencies. I called Damien's house, knowing they'd be out at Vivian's sister's party, and left a message asking him to check the freezer in the basement for an old coffee can. While I waited for him to call back, I explored other options. I could ask Cordelia about working in her office to earn the extra money, but that would delay the purchase. I could try to get a loan, but at 67 with minimal income, that seemed unlikely. My phone rang at 10 p.m. Damien's voice was tight with anger and worry. "Where the hell are you? Mom? We've been calling hospitals, police stations." I left a note. "A note. You disappeared on Christmas Day and left a note." "Damien, listen to me. Is there a coffee can in the basement freezer behind the frozen vegetables?" "What? Why would..." Just check. Please. I heard him talking to Vivian. Footsteps on stairs. The sound of a freezer opening. Jesus. Mom. There's a coffee can here, with money in it, a lot of money. Relief flooded through me. How much? I don't know. I'm not counting your money. Where are you? We need to talk. How much? Damien. A long pause. Maybe 3,000, Mom. Where are you? I'm buying a house. I'll call you in a few days. I hung up before he could respond. $3,000 my mother had hidden away. For emergencies, she'd always said. At 67, starting over, qualified as an emergency. The next morning, I called Cordelia and told her to draw up the papers. I was going home. Moving day came with a February blizzard that made the moving truck slide sideways down my new gravel driveway. The driver, a philosophical man named Carl who'd been moving families for 30 years, took one look at the farmhouse and shook his head. Lady, you sure about this? That's a lot of house for one person, and we're pretty far from civilization out here. I'm sure, I said, signing his clipboard while snow swirled around us. My possessions. What was left after selling most of my furniture looked pathetic, scattered around Evangeline Winterbourne's spacious rooms, a bed, a dresser, my kitchen table, and boxes of books and personal items. It wasn't much to show for 67 years of life. But it was mine. Carl and his partner unloaded everything in an hour, accepted my tip and a thermos of coffee, and drove away, leaving me alone in my new home. The silence was profound. No traffic noise, no neighbors' televisions, no family members discussing my inadequacies in the next room, just the wind in the pine trees and the settling sounds of an old house adjusting to new occupancy. The first month was harder than I'd expected. The roof leaked in 3 places, not 2 as Cordelia had mentioned, and I learned to position buckets with the precision of a meteorologist. The furnace had personality. It would run perfectly for days, then refused to start until I talked to it firmly and gave it a strategic kick. The water pressure was unpredictable, and the electrical system seemed to have been installed sometime during the Coolidge administration. But slowly, room by room, I began to make the house mine. I patched the leaks with guidance from YouTube videos and help from Pat Mill's husband, who turned out to be handy with roofing. I painted the living room a warm cream color that made the space feel larger and brighter. In the kitchen, I kept Evangeline's mint green cabinets, but updated the hardware and added new curtains. More importantly, I was learning about my new community. Cedar Hollow operated on what Maggie called Minnesota nice, a combination of genuine kindness and strategic minding of one's own business. People helped when you needed help, but didn't ask intrusive questions. Pat Mills brought me casseroles during my first week and introduced me to the other women in the neighborhood. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Eleanor, helped me get a library card and pointed me toward books about small business management. By March, I'd settled into a routine. Coffee at sunrise in the kitchen, watching the cardinal who'd claimed the bird feeder as his personal breakfast spot, morning walks around my property, checking on the garden area where things were beginning to poke through the soil, afternoons working on house projects or reading, evenings writing in my journal about this strange new life I was building. The isolation that should have been lonely felt like luxury. No one criticized my cooking or rearranged my furniture. No one told me I was watching too much television or not enough. No one made me feel like my very existence was an inconvenience. I could eat cereal for dinner if I wanted, or spend an entire afternoon reading without anyone asking if I had something more useful to do. But as spring arrived and the house began to feel like home, I found myself thinking about Evangeline's legacy. She'd raised 7 children here, welcomed countless neighbors and friends, made this place a hub of warmth and hospitality. I had the house, but I wasn't using it the way she had. I was living like a hermit in a place designed for community. The idea came to me gradually. What if I opened the house to travelers? Not a traditional bed and breakfast. Cedar Hollow already had the Pineview Lodge for that. But something different, a place for women who needed time to think, to plan, to heal. Women like me, who'd found themselves displaced and searching for new beginnings. I called it a healing retreat when I mentioned the idea to Cordelia over coffee at the local diner. She was immediately enthusiastic. "Brilliant," she said, stabbing her pancakes for emphasis. "There's nothing like that in this part of Minnesota. Women drive hours to get to those fancy spa places in the cities, but this would be different, more personal, more affordable." "Do you think there'd be interest?" "Honey, half the women I know could use a week away from their regular lives to figure out what comes next, and the other half just need a place where they can breathe without someone asking them what's for dinner." I spent April researching the legalities and logistics. The house was already zoned for commercial use. Evangeline had run a small catering business from the kitchen in her later years. I'd need basic business insurance and health department approval for the kitchen, but the barriers were manageable. More challenging was the marketing. How do you advertise a service for women having life crises? I started small, with a simple website that Lydia Chen, the 19-year-old daughter of the librarian, helped me create. The tagline was, "A place for women to rest, reflect, and restart." And the first page featured a photo of the farmhouse at sunset, with a brief description of what I was offering: private rooms, home-cooked meals, peaceful surroundings, and no judgment. Come as you are, leave when you're ready. My first guest arrived in May. Isadora Nightingale was 52, recently divorced, and desperately in need of space to figure out her next chapter. She'd found my website through a women's forum where someone had mentioned a farm in Minnesota that helps women start over. "I don't know what I'm doing," she told me over dinner that first night. "I was married for 26 years. I don't know how to be just Isadora instead of Tom's wife or the kid's mother." "That's exactly what this place is for," I said, pouring her another glass of wine. "Learning who you are when you're not taking care of everyone else." Isadora stayed for 5 days. She helped me plant the vegetable garden, read 3 novels she'd been meaning to get to for years, and talked through her plans for the future. When she left, she hugged me tight and said, "This place saved my life. Thank you for understanding what I needed before I knew I needed it." She also left a review on the travel website where she'd found me. "Winterborn Haven is exactly what it promises, a place to breathe and figure things out. Serafina creates an atmosphere of acceptance and peace that's impossible to find elsewhere. I came broken and left with a plan, highly recommended for any woman ready to invest in her own future." Word spread through the networks that connected women seeking change. By summer, I was hosting 1 or 2 guests most weeks. Persephone Ashworth, a travel blogger burned out on constant movement, spent 2 weeks helping me organize the barn into a writing retreat space. Celestine Foxworth, an artist going through a messy divorce, transformed the barn's loft into a temporary studio where she created some of her best work. Each woman brought her own story, her own pain, and her own strength. They helped with meals, shared books and advice, and created an informal support network that extended far beyond their stays at Winterborn Haven. I kept a guest book where they could leave messages for future visitors, and it filled with encouragement, recipes, book recommendations, and contact information for women who wanted to stay connected. The financial reality was less romantic but manageable. I charged $45 per night, which covered my expenses and provided a modest income. Combined with my Social Security, I was earning between $1,800 and $2,500 per month during the busy season, enough to pay my mortgage, maintain the house, and set aside money for winter when guests were fewer. But it wasn't just about the money. For the first time since Theodore's death, I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with other people's expectations of me. I was good at this work, creating safe spaces, listening without judging, cooking meals that nourished both body and spirit. The skills I'd developed as a mother and wife translated perfectly to running a retreat for women in transition. By August, I realized I needed help. The business had grown beyond what one person could manage alone, and I was starting to feel the physical strain of cleaning rooms, cooking for multiple guests, and handling all the administrative work. Through Eleanor at the library, I found Maya Chen, a 25-year-old recent college graduate who'd moved back to Cedar Hollow to care for her aging grandmother. Maya was perfect organized, tech-savvy, and genuinely interested in the mission of Winterborn Haven. She worked part-time, handling bookings, managing the website, and helping with housekeeping. Having her support allowed me to focus on what I did best, creating an environment where women felt safe to explore who they were becoming. As autumn arrived and the leaves turned brilliant reds and golds, I reflected on how much had changed since that Christmas morning when I'd been locked in Damien's bedroom. The woman who'd climbed out that metaphorical window had been broken, displaced, uncertain of her worth. The woman who now welcomed strangers into her home and helped them find their footing was confident, purposeful, and genuinely happy. But the past has a way of catching up with you, even when you think you've left it behind completely. September arrived with a crispness that promised an early winter, and with it came unexpected validation. Persephone Ashworth's article about Winterborn Haven was published in Minnesota Monthly Magazine, complete with professional photographs of the farmhouse and a glowing description of the revolutionary approach to women's wellness that prioritizes emotional healing over luxury amenities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My simple website crashed from traffic, and Maya spent 2 days fielding phone calls from women wanting to book stays. We were booked solid through November, with a waiting list that extended into the new year. "This is incredible," Maya said, hanging up from yet another potential guest. "We might need to expand, maybe offer weekend workshops or group retreats." The success felt surreal. A year ago, I'd been treated like a burden in my own son's house. Now I was running a business that women drove hundreds of miles to experience. Local newspapers wanted interviews, and I'd been invited to speak at a conference for women entrepreneurs in Duluth. But success brought new challenges. Some guests arrived with expectations that didn't match reality. They wanted luxury spa treatments and gourmet dining, not the simple comfort and honest conversation that Winterborn Haven actually offered. A few left negative reviews online, complaining about the dated accommodations and lack of professional services. More troubling were the guests who arrived in crisis so deep that I felt unprepared to help them. Rachel Morrison came in October, fresh from an abusive marriage, flinching every time a door closed too loudly. Diana Price arrived 2 weeks later in the midst of a nervous breakdown, having lost her job, her home, and her marriage in quick succession. I did my best to provide the listening ear and safe space they needed, but I worried about the ethics of operating without professional counseling credentials. What if someone harmed themselves while staying at my retreat? What if my well-intentioned support wasn't enough? "You're not trying to be a therapist," Maggie reminded me when I shared my concerns over dinner at the Pineview Lodge. "You're providing what those expensive retreats don't: genuine human connection and practical support. Sometimes that's exactly what someone needs to get back on their feet." Still, I started researching mental health first aid courses and building relationships with professional counselors in the area who could provide referrals when needed. The last thing I wanted was for Winterborn Haven to become a place where vulnerable women weren't safe. October also brought a health scare that forced me to confront the realities of aging. I was cleaning gutters on a particularly windy day, something I probably shouldn't have been doing alone, when a sudden gust knocked me off balance. The fall wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to break my left wrist and give me a concussion that left me dizzy and nauseous for days. Maya stepped up magnificently, managing the retreat almost single-handedly while I recovered. The guests that week, 3 women in their 40s dealing with empty nest syndrome, rallied around me with the kind of care I'd been providing others. They cooked meals, handled laundry, and created an atmosphere of mutual support that reminded me why I'd started this work in the first place. But the incident was a wake-up call. At 68, I couldn't pretend I was invulnerable. The doctor who treated my wrist was blunt about the risks of living alone in such a remote location. "You need to think about emergency plans," she said. "What happens if you fall and can't get to a phone? What happens if the retreat is full and you have a medical emergency?" For the first time since moving to Cedar Hollow, I felt the weight of my isolation. I'd been so focused on proving my independence that I'd ignored the reality that independence and interdependence weren't mutually exclusive. I needed to build better support systems, both for my safety and for the long-term sustainability of Winterborn Haven. November brought another challenge, my first difficult guest. Margaret Caldwell arrived with an attitude of entitlement that immediately set everyone on edge. She complained about the Wi-Fi speed, criticized the simple meals, and made passive-aggressive comments about the amateur nature of the operation. Worse, she was condescending to Maya and dismissive of the other guests' stories. After 3 days of mounting tension, I had to ask her to leave. It was the first time I'd had to fire a guest, and it shook my confidence. Was I too particular about the atmosphere I wanted to create? Was I limiting the reach of Winterborn Haven by insisting on a certain kind of respectful behavior? "Some people aren't ready for what you're offering," Cordelia said when I called her for advice. "They want to pay for a service and remain consumers instead of becoming part of a community. That's not what you're building here, and that's okay." She was right, but the encounter made me realize I needed clearer boundaries and policies. Maya and I spent several evenings that month creating a guest handbook that outlined expectations for behavior, communication, and mutual respect. We also developed a screening process for new guests that included a phone conversation about what they hoped to gain from their stay. The most surprising challenge came from an unexpected source: my own success. By late November, I was fielding calls from investors who wanted to franchise the Winterborn Haven concept, publishers interested in a book deal, and conference organizers offering speaking fees that exceeded my monthly income. Part of me was flattered by the attention, but a larger part was concerned about losing the essential intimacy that made the retreat work. How could I maintain the personal touch that guests valued while scaling up to meet demand? How could I preserve the authentic community feeling if Winterborn Haven became a brand? "You don't have to decide anything right now," Maya pointed out during one of our evening planning sessions. "You can take the opportunities that feel right and decline the ones that don't. Success doesn't mean you have to say yes to everything." Her wisdom reminded me why I'd hired her. At 25, she understood something about balance and intentionality that had taken me decades to learn. Maybe that was one of the unexpected gifts of starting over later in life, the ability to recognize what truly mattered and the confidence to protect it. As December approached, I found myself thinking about the anniversary that was coming. A year since that Christmas morning when my family had locked me away and I decided to lock them out in return. A year since I'd climbed on a bus with $847 and no plan beyond escape. The woman who'd made that desperate journey felt like a stranger now. She'd been so focused on what she was running from that she couldn't see what she might be running toward. Now I knew I'd been running toward Winterborn Haven, toward this life where I was valued for what I contributed rather than tolerated for what I represented. But as much as I'd grown and changed, there were still loose threads from my old life that needed attention. Questions about whether the bridges I'd burned could be rebuilt, or if they should be. The phone call that would force those questions came on a snowy evening in mid-December. As I was reviewing reservation requests for the new year, and Maya was updating the website with photos from our recent guest stays, when I saw Damien's name on the caller ID, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, as I had with all his previous attempts to contact me. But something about the timing, so close to the anniversary of my departure, made me pick up. "Hello, Damien." His voice was different from the angry, worried tone I remembered from our last conversation. Smaller somehow, less certain. "Mom, how are you?" "I'm well, busy with the business. We're booked solid through New Year's." A pause. That's great. Mom, really great. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. I'd learned the power of not rushing to fill uncomfortable spaces. Listen, he said finally. I was calling about Christmas. We'd like to invite you to dinner if you want to come. I mean, no pressure. But the kids have been asking about you, especially Lirelei. What's changed? Damien? The question seemed to catch him off guard. A lot of things. Vivian and we've been going to counseling, family therapy, and the kids, they're older now. They understand better what happened last year. And what do you tell them happened? The truth. That we treated you badly, and you left because of it. The honesty surprised me. For months after my departure, I'd assumed they'd written me off as a difficult old woman who'd chosen pride over family. Apparently, I'd been wrong. This conversation would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. As I listened to my son's voice vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child, I felt something shifting in my chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but the possibility of something new. Sarah's 18 now, Damien continued, using Lirelei's given name in that formal way that meant he was nervous. She's applying to colleges, thinking about her future, and she said something last week that really hit me. She said she hoped she'd be brave enough to stand up for herself when she got older, the way her grandmother did. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Lirelei, my granddaughter, who'd laughed at my expense that Christmas morning, had learned something from my disappearance after all. "How is Vivian with all this?" I asked. Damien sighed, and I could picture him running his hand through his hair the way he'd done as a boy when he was working up the courage to confess something. "She's learning. The therapist helped her understand that families can't function when some members are treated as less important than others. She's working on it. We both are." Through the kitchen window, I could see Maya in the barn, setting up for a pottery workshop one of our guests had requested. The sight reminded me of how much my life had changed, how much I'd built since that desperate Christmas morning. "I appreciate the invitation," I said finally, "but I can't leave the business. I have guests coming for Christmas Day. The holidays are hard for people who don't have traditional families. They need somewhere to go." It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I'd built something here that mattered more to me than repairing a relationship that had been broken for longer than I'd been willing to admit. I'd created a chosen family of women who understood resilience, who valued kindness over blood ties, who knew the difference between being alone and being lonely. "Maybe," Damien's voice was tentative, "maybe we could come there. I know it's your place, your business, but if there's room..." I considered this. The house would be full. I'd invited several former guests to return for the holidays. Women who'd become friends over the months, who wanted to spend Christmas somewhere they felt valued rather than tolerated. "You'd be guests," I said carefully. "Not family visiting family, but paying guests at a retreat. Same rules as everyone else." "Of course, whatever you think is fair. $200 per night, 3-night minimum, meals included, but you help with dishes and respect the other guests' privacy." "That's fine. More than fine." I could hear Vivian's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Damien covered the phone for a moment, then came back. "Vivian wants to know if there are any other rules she should know about." I smiled, thinking of the house guidelines I'd developed over the months. They'd evolved as I'd learned what created harmony among women who were all rebuilding their lives in various ways. No criticizing other people's choices unless they ask for advice. No discussing money unless it's directly relevant to safety. No comments about appearance, weight, or age. And absolutely no tolerance for anyone who makes another guest feel unwelcome or judged. Those are very specific rules. They work. After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. The house hummed around me with the sounds of a life fully lived, the furnace working efficiently after the repairs I'd made in the spring. The grandfather clock in the hallway that I'd bought at an estate sale. The settling noises of old wood that had sheltered generations of people seeking comfort. Maya came in from the barn, her cheeks red from the cold, clay dust on her hands despite the December weather. She'd been working with Celestine on a series of bowls that would be gifts for the Christmas guests. "Damien called," I said as she poured herself coffee from the pot that never seemed to empty. "He wants to bring his family for Christmas." Maya raised an eyebrow. She'd heard the story, as all my long-term staff and regular guests had. We didn't share secrets at Winterbourne Haven, but we shared truth when it was offered freely. "How do you feel about that?" "Honestly curious. I want to see who they've become, whether they've actually changed or just learned to perform change well enough to fool themselves. And if they haven't changed," I considered this, "then they'll find out that Serafina Blackwood isn't someone who can be locked in a room anymore." Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow and temperatures cold enough to make your breath visible indoors until the fire got going properly. The house was full 6 guests plus Damien's family, all moving around each other with the careful politeness of people learning how to share space respectfully. Damien, Vivian, Caspian, and Liralee had arrived exactly at check-in time 2 days earlier, their usual confident demeanor replaced by something more cautious. They'd followed the house rules without complaint, helped with meal preparation, and made genuine efforts to connect with the other guests without prying into their stories. Liralee had surprised me most. At 16 now, she'd grown into my cheekbones and Theodore's stubborn chin. She'd spent the previous evening helping me prepare Christmas breakfast, asking thoughtful questions about the business and listening to stories about the women who'd stayed here. "I'm sorry," she said, as we worked side by side, rolling out biscuit dough. "About that Christmas, about laughing when Mom said those things. I was 15 and stupid, and I thought being mean was the same as being grown up." I really looked, and saw not the giggling teenager who'd dismissed her grandmother, but a young woman who'd learned something about compassion in the past year. "Apology accepted," I said. "But more importantly, what did you learn? That families should build each other up, not tear each other down, and that just because someone's older doesn't mean they don't have feelings." She paused, concentrating on cutting perfect circles, "and that I want to be the kind of woman who stands up for herself, like you did." Christmas morning unfolded with the easy rhythm I'd perfected over the months. Everyone helped with breakfast. Conversation flowed naturally between strangers who'd become temporary family, and no one mentioned the strangeness of celebrating Christmas in a retreat run by a woman who'd disappeared from her family a year earlier. After breakfast, we gathered in the living room for the gift exchange I'd instituted. Small, handmade things that represented the giver's interests or skills. Celestine had made pottery bowls for everyone. Persephone, who'd returned for the holidays, had written personalized poems. Isadora had knitted scarves in everyone's favorite colors. Damien gave me a photo album he'd made himself, filled with pictures of our family from better times, him as a little boy. Theodore before the drinking got bad. Christmas mornings when we'd been happy. The last page held a single photo of me standing on the porch of this house, taken during his March visit. I looked strong and content in a way I hadn't in years. "I wanted to remember all of it," he said quietly. "The good parts and the parts where I failed you, so I don't forget either one." Vivian's gift was more practical, a beautiful wooden sign for the front yard, professionally carved with Winterbourne Haven a place for new beginnings in elegant script. It was expensive, thoughtful, and completely without the passive-aggressive undertones that had characterized most of her gestures toward me in the past. But Liralee's gift made me cry. She handed me a small wrapped box, her expression nervous and hopeful. Inside was a silver pendant shaped like a key, hanging from a delicate chain. "It's to remind you," she said, "that you always have the key to your own life, and that you taught me I have the key to mine too. I put the necklace on immediately, feeling the weight of the small silver key against my chest. Around me, the living room hummed with conversation and laughter, genuine laughter, the kind that built connections instead of tearing them down. Later, as the afternoon light faded and guests prepared for their evening activities, Damien found me in the kitchen, washing dishes. "Thank you," he said, drying a platter with one of Celestine's hand-woven dish towels. "For letting us come, for giving us a chance to do better." "This isn't forgiveness," I said, wanting to be clear. "This is a beginning. If it's going to work, it has to be different than it was before." "I know, we all know." He set down the towel and looked at me directly. "I spent most of my adult life thinking that being a man meant making decisions for everyone else, especially the women in my family. I thought I was protecting you by managing you. I was wrong. Yes. You were the woman who left last Christmas. She was right to leave. And the woman who built this place, who created this life, she's amazing. I'm proud to be your son, even if I don't deserve to be." I studied his face, looking for calculation, manipulation, the subtle signs that this was performance rather than genuine change. I didn't find them. "You'll always be my son," I said finally. "But if you want to be part of my life, it has to be as equals. I'm not your responsibility, and you're not my authority. We're adults who choose to love each other, or we're nothing." "Equals," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I can live with that." "Good, because I've learned that I can live without it if I have to." That evening, I sat on my porch despite the cold, wrapped in the quilt I'd brought from Damien's house, watching the snow fall in the lamplight. The house glowed warm behind me, full of people who'd chosen to spend Christmas in a place that felt like home, even if it wasn't the home they'd started with. My phone buzzed with texts, thank you messages from current and former guests, holiday greetings from the community I'd built in Cedar Hollow, and a message from Lyra Lay. "Love you, Grandma. Thanks for teaching me to be brave." I looked out at the 5 acres that belonged to me, at the barn where Celestine was probably still working on her pottery, at the garden where I'd plant tomatoes and beans and flowers come spring. At 68, I'd learned that the most devastating thing you could do to people who'd undervalued you was to prove them wrong by building a life so rich and full that their absence from it was barely noticeable. But sometimes, if they were willing to change, if they were willing to meet you as equals in the life you'd created without them, something better than vindication was possible. Something like redemption, something like family, chosen deliberately and built on respect, something like home. I fingered the silver key at my throat and smiled. Tomorrow, I'd have new guests arriving, women looking for a place to rest and regroup, to remember their worth and plan their next chapters. I'd welcome them the way Evangeline Winterbourne had welcomed strangers for 60 years, the way I'd learned to welcome myself after too many years of believing I was unwelcome everywhere. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in new possibilities. And I went inside to my chosen family, to my thriving business, to the life I'd built one brave decision at a time. At 68, I was finally home. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.